to record. So you'll all be giving acknowledgement that we're recording that. So thanks very much. And Kim and I will figure out how we're going to be posting these back up. So if you haven't been able to join all 5 days or want to review some of the great conversations we've had, we'll have links to you for next week. A reminder that we are celebrating Not-for-Profit Appreciation Week, and that Conversations That Matter is a partnership between 4 Simple Words, of which I am the Chief Learning Officer, Kurt Hammond, and I have the gift of being your host today. So thank you very much for that. And this is very much in partnership with our good friends and the great people at PIN, which is a People Information Network based in Guelph, Wellington, and Kim Cusimano in particular, their executive director, who has been such a gift in pulling all this together. So a partnership between our 2 organizations to celebrate the good things happening in the not-for-profit sector, hopefully do some learning from one another and you as well today. So a reminder that on Monday, we chatted with Jim Moss, who was from the YMCA Workwell group, and we chatted about staff burnout and this elusive idea we call work-life balance. Yesterday, we chatted with the great Kathy Taylor from the Ontario Not-for-Profit Network, where we really started to put some language around what this new normal is going to look like for our sector. Today, we welcome Kim, Jane, Heather, and Carine. We'll do a formal introduction of them in a minute, and we're talking all things volunteer. Before we jump in any further, our land acknowledgement, you've probably heard this a couple times if you've been joining us. I appreciate, I've had some really nice feedback on this, and I'm grateful for that. If you'd like a copy of this, you can find a copy of all our acknowledgements at forcimplewords.ca on the contact page. If you scroll down, you can find a copy of these. So a reminder that no matter where we are today, no matter where we're gathering from, there were peoples, cultures, and traditions on these very lands long before we were. And these wise people did their best to help us steward our land, our water, and our air. Now, unfortunately, we've done a terrible job at listening to their wisdom, and our environment is now paying that price. Worse than that, and much worse, and I think it's important to keep that in mind, much worse, is that yet we have to fully acknowledge that our communities are literally built on top of theirs. And we can no longer turn away from the economic, social, and emotional damage that we have done to generations of families across this country. And today, as we think about building community, as we think about serving others, I want to remind us that those are values and gifts that started with Indigenous cultures. So today's conversation is very much a continuation of the values and gifts that those cultures brought to us. It's important for us to remind those leaders that are following us that as they continue on these conversations, though they started with Indigenous cultures and values. And as I've said before, I have no solutions to how we really right relations with our Indigenous sisters and brothers. I myself am just coming to terms with the word settler and realizing that my home is on stolen land. So I have no solutions to that. But what I do want to share is a reminder that we have been handed a gift from these cultures and peoples. It's up to us to steward and honor those traditions. And here in Canada, truth has to come before reconciliation. So that's our land acknowledgement today. Thank you for that time. How about some nonprofit Appreciation Week stats? What's a session without a few stats, right? A few numbers. So we're talking about volunteers today. Again, thanks to the Not-for-Profit Network for these. There are 5 million volunteers in Ontario. Holy shnikes, that's a lot of people, right? Like that just blows my mind. There are 5 million people that give up their time and effort to be involved in the not-for-profit sector. That equates to 820 million hours of time, 820 million hours of time given by leaders into their communities and into organizations. And where the rubber hits the road and where we can start to get some attention on the power of volunteers is that equates to 400,000 full-time jobs. That's a big number, 400,000 full-time jobs coming from the hands of volunteers. So if we're looking to remind funders and governments of the important role that our sector plays, I think that's the big one for me. 400,000 full-time jobs, that are being driven into our economy. Because we know that volunteers drive the not-for-profit sector, and we know that their needs and our needs have shifted over the past 10 years and specifically over the past 2. And that's, I think, where we're going to have lots of conversation today. So let's have a frank and open conversation around what it means, what volunteers mean to Ontario, and how we can better honor and respect that. Before we jump in, let's chat a bit about 4 simple words and some of the learning we're doing there. And again, I appreciate your time to share this with you. A reminder that on Monday, we had a quick chat around why I think the term servant leadership is outdated, and we need to move beyond that into this idea of service leadership. The simple matter that if I'm being a servant to someone or anyone's being a servant to me, we cannot be in equity. Where service leadership demands that we are in equity and in service to one another. Yesterday with Kathy, we talked about the 4 simple words. It's not about me. And we chatted a bit about how I believe they can simplify your life, they can clear your mind, and amplify our impact. So today, and again, all this thinking and exploration that we're doing is available at 4simplewords.ca. Today, I just want to give you a quick overview of what I think the 3 steps to good service leadership look like. And again, this is based on hundreds of conversations that I've had with leaders, lots of reading. This needs to go through a lot more filters and have a lot more input. So I welcome your feedback on this. But there's 3 steps to service leadership that I want to remind us of. And I think this comes back to some of the conversations that I've had with people this week from these sessions. Number 1, the first step to service leadership is self-awareness. So there's some irony there. And for those of you that didn't hear, the 4 simple words came from my grandmother. It's not about me. Well, in fact, service leadership starts with me. So there's an irony there that we need to be playing up a little bit more. Because the more I understand myself, the more I understand what ticks me off, what turns me on, the more and better I can serve. I need to manage my own time, my own needs, and my own energy so that I can truly be in service to others. When I'm clear and honest with myself about how much time I can spare, how much energy I can give without losing myself in the process, I'm going to be an effective leader. Service leadership is not about sacrifice. It is about making sure that I am looking after myself in the process. So I have this growing and ongoing sense of self-awareness, which leads us to step 2, which is that now I get to look for gaps and needs. And this is the fun part of service leadership. Because it's not about me, I can poke my head up and look around a bit and say, oh, could I be adding value over there? Could I be exploring what this looks like? Could I be looking to co-create some meaningful change? And again, because I'm always coming back to step 1 about what turns my crank and what turns me off, I can look for authentic and meaningful places for me to serve. Understanding that in doing that serving, I'm also getting some benefits to myself. So service leadership starts with self-awareness. It then that self-awareness allows me to look for gaps and needs. And number 3, and here's a big difference between servant leadership and service leadership, is I am going to create transparent relationships with those people I'm in service to. The gift there is that I'm being crystal clear on what I think I can give you. And in return, you're being crystal clear back to me on if that is continues to be of value. And where I see servant leadership falling down is I continue to give you the same thing, but turns out you don't need that anymore. And that's the arrogance I spoke to on Monday. Where service leadership, I am continually checking in to make sure that what the service I'm bringing you is still of need to you. Because, and here's the magic, circling back to number 1, it gives me off ramps. Good service leadership is giving ourselves off ramps to say, it has been a gift and an honor to be of service to you. I think we're done. Yes, head nod. I'm moving on and I'm giving myself that time and energy again. I hope there's a nice circle there from self-awareness, looking for needs, transparent relationships that have natural off ramps, and then go back to me healing and looking after myself. That's the 3 steps that I think are ground service leadership in or ground service leadership. Kim is saying it sounds like volunteerism. Absolutely, right? There's a reason Kim and I are doing this together. I think there's huge overlap here. I welcome your feedback. I welcome your thoughts. You can find out more at 4simplewords.ca. All right, Hammond, let's get into it. 4 smart guests that are joining us today. I'm going to give them quick introductions, and then we're going to jump right into conversations. Our chat is available, of course, as questions pop up. Jump in there. Kim and I will be paying attention to that. Our first guest, you know her, you love her. She is Kim Cusimano, Executive Director from the PIN Network, which has been building volunteers for the past 20 years. Kim herself brings 25 years of experience in education, recreation, community development, and volunteer engagement through PIN. And through her role as Executive Director, Kim works alongside the incredible team and board to support their organizational mission, which is 3 pillars: community information, nonprofit leadership, and volunteerism. So welcome, Kim. Joining Kim today is Jen Hennig, who is Executive Director of Volunteer Waterloo Region. Jane, thanks so much for being here. Volunteer Waterloo Region provides services that strengthen the capacity of over 150 charities and not-for-profit organizations in their community. Jane currently provides sector leadership through her roles as co-convener for the Wellbeing Waterloo Region, past chair of the boards at Volunteer Canada and St. Luke's Evangelical Church. She's a leadership participant with the Ontario Volunteer Centre Network. And in addition to that, Jane is continuously working to demonstrate the value of community engagement, the impact of community engagement locally and beyond. So Jane, welcome and thank you for being here. Heather Johnson is Director of Volunteer Halton, and she's been working in the not-for-profit sector since 2003 and has held a variety of roles. Her current role is a Director of Volunteer Halton, and that allows her the opportunity to share her expertise and knowledge with the not-for-profit sector with other leaders in the Halton region. Volunteer engagement is in her blood, and the opportunity to tell the story of an organization or cause excites her and in fact drives the passion for her work. Lastly, but certainly not least, is Carine Strong, who is Executive Director of Volunteer MBC and Chair of the Ontario Volunteer Network. So Carine started Volunteer MBC in September 2008. Boy, that's a long time ago, wasn't it? And has brought the center to a 30-year history in progressively senior management positions in customer service, community relations, corporate social responsibility, marketing and communications, purchasing, both in the private and public sectors. She's dedicated her personal life to volunteering and spends approximately 50 hours a month trying to make a difference in her community. In that capacity, she sits on a number of local and provincial national boards and holds executive director positions with 2 organizations, including the chair of a Caledon Parent-Child Center. So ladies and gentlemen, we have got some dedicated, smart, experienced leaders joining us. Let's give a warm welcome to our guests today. Let's give them a round of applause. Excellent. All right, we've got some questions. I'm going to look in the chat in a second. Let's get ourselves going. And maybe Kim, you want to kick us off here. How have volunteers supported our communities through the pandemic? I really want to think about the impact that volunteers have had over the past 2 years in particular. Can you paint a picture of what that looks like for us?
Perfect, thank you. And first off, I'd just like to thank my peers, Carine, Jane, and Heather for joining in today. Really appreciate your gift of time, your expertise, and your leadership. And of course, to Kurt for continuing to be a great host and facilitate these conversations. So what did it look like? Of course, in March 2020, we've got a big clampdown of programs, of services, of events, magnitudes of volunteers and volunteer programming volunteering services that were closed, that were curtailed. So what did that look like? Kurt mentioned earlier some, some stats around volunteerism, and you think about the volume, the impact of volunteerism in this province, let alone the country. And it's great. I want to give a shout out to Allison Stevens from Volunteer Canada. I see you here on the call today. Thank you for your support. But, Ontario volunteers contribute 2.7 billion to Canada's GDP. This is not a nice to have. This is integral to our very lives. And so when you have these programs and these services and these events, coaching, mentoring, all those sorts of things, it's a big impact. So we see these closures happen, but it's almost a dichotomy because people want to help in an emergency. So while there isn't the opportunities, and we did see in a survey that PIN did in the fall of 2020 and repeated in the fall of 2021, we saw that there was a 61 and 62% decrease in volunteerism through the respondents. And that mirrored exactly the same and aligned with the report from the Ontario Nonprofit Network, who had indicated 61% decline in volunteerism. That is huge. But again, people wanted to help. And so when I think about PIN, I want to share that, and volunteer engagement is nowhere near anything to do with a portal or a matching service. So we'll be real honest about that. It's about relationships, and volunteer centers are key in that, as you are as leaders of volunteers, leaders of organizations, and driving the mission forward to support our communities. But, in PIN's portal alone, there was a 262% increase in volunteers wanting to help in referrals. And why is that? It was around pandemic emergent needs. That is significant to consider where people's interests were, and it really solidifies the concept about people wanting to help for emergent needs. So when those opportunities aren't there for people for the way that they want to help, I know that PIN certainly fielded calls from individuals, particularly in the early days, where people would call and they'd say, I'd like to test and trace. I could do that for public health. Well, there wasn't a role for that. I could do something in, my background is in biomedical science. What can I do? Well, there's not a role for that. But when there's not a role, what happens? People want to act, they want to help. And you saw great things happen around mask making, around supporting neighbors to neighbors, making sure that people had food, that people needed to get to where they needed to go. You also saw some really interesting things like vaccine hunters of Canada, rapid test finders. So when there are holes in our systems and gaps, we have people that want to volunteer and to fill those gaps. So through a survey, the Ontario Volunteer Centre Network is a strong group of volunteer centers. And we had done a survey in the fall of 2021. And what we were able to gain from that, the data about that, is volunteer centers had supported and developed and strengthened relationships with more than 4,300 nonprofits in the province of Ontario. And during that first 18 months of the year of this pandemic, volunteer centers supported 3.3 million volunteer seekers. Again, not a small number, and really telling about what people wanted to do, how they wanted to help, and the power that human resource, that natural human resource. I think we should have that as part of our country, not just in mining or in other natural resources, forests and things. We have it in people power. So, my peers are going to do a deeper dive into some of these topics and areas about why there was a decline, but people wanted to help. Again, when we're decreasing the amount of opportunities for people, when organizations have closed completely, whether physical restrictions are preventing us from having, I was talking to Kurt yesterday, big festival that happens in Elora, Ontario. It's called Riverfest. Riverfest, right? It draws thousands of people. There would be, think about your communities, look around, there's many opportunities where those things just weren't able to happen. So
Right.
that's kind of a bit of a lay of the landscape about how people were helping, really around emergent needs.
Good.
And the question I think that I would pose is really, how are we going to take that interest in emergent needs and transition that into ongoing supports for the work that we do?
Excellent.
Similarly to probably conversations that fundraisers are having.
Right.
How do we take those donors that just donated money because of the emergency? How are we going to translate them? How are we going to get that through a pipeline to be an ongoing, say, monthly donor?
Right. Excellent start, Kim. Thanks for that. And yeah, quick shout out to Riverfest, Elora. If you are looking for something to do in the third week of August, come up to Elora. It is the most fun. I see my good friend Amy Weaver here. It's some funnest, bestest, like rock and roll weekend ever. So Riverfest, Elora, shout out to the good people there. Building on that, and perhaps more importantly, Carine, there's been a lot of changes that we've seen in the sector. Kim kind of set that up for us, both in what volunteer needs, but I think also in how our services or our systems have been meeting those needs. So talk to us about that change and maybe build on some of the insights that Kim had there.
Yeah, so, Kim's right, but the reality is volunteer centers were already fighting a really downward trend in volunteerism, and then the pandemic hit. So within weeks, tens of thousands of volunteers, we all saw this, were stepping up either, in a structured environment or not structured. And, they really were there to respond. And, this surge in participation was greater than anything we've seen in recent memory. But the paradox is that volunteer interest continues to far outstrip the demand as organizations have been disrupted and volunteer engagement has been deprioritized or eliminated in organizations just because the capacity is not there to engage them. And as organizations, kind of put on their proverbial oxygen masks, they really divested in their future capacity. And we're seeing this play out in huge proportion, a disproportion of, the number of volunteer positions supplied to the demand. There's been a slow increase, ever so slowly, in the availability of certain roles, but we still have a really, really long way to go. And what was really concerning is that the pandemic, it hit us all, but it didn't hit us all equally. And the most vulnerable members of our society have felt the greatest impact. So as the demand on food banks and shelters spiked, so did the need for the volunteer drivers, and volunteer centers have really sprung up to help these organizations to recruit more volunteer drivers to bring food and essentials to where they were really needed the most. And there's a saying that I'm reminded of by Leonard Cohen: there's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. So this is kind of exactly what happened. Seniors used to be the largest cohort of volunteers, giving immense hours to important causes, but that's changing. And as a vulnerable group, many of these seniors have been unable or reluctant to volunteer during the pandemic. And, are they going to come back? We don't know. And at the same time, youth have also faced multiple barriers to participation. And many of the most in-need roles have been really geared toward adult participation, like the Meals on Wheels programs and PPE delivery activities. And so leaders of volunteers simply have not had time to engage many youth in meaningful roles. But they desperately need volunteering to help them build resilience, to get that sense of community belonging and build their skills to really increase their employability. And so amid the challenges, and there have been many, there are some wonderful sparks of innovation. Micro-volunteering is on the rise, and quick activities we've seen, like writing a letter to an isolated senior, helping, purchase groceries for your neighbor. Those have created opportunities for community connection and participation. And there's also, including in this, is the episodic volunteering. Organizations should really consider the role of project-based type volunteers that can play, a role to build their pandemic recovery capacity. So, a volunteer that can review HR manuals, that can assist with a hybrid IT infrastructure design, offer Marcom support. And this really speaks to another accelerating trend, which is an increase in virtual volunteer positions.
Right.
Organizations, have tried to bring their programs and services online, but they need help to do it. And, volunteers with digital skills can make a big difference by providing that tech support, helping to monitor social media platforms. And I think this is where going forward, youth can really play a big role. We all know how good they are, with social media. So despite the wave of change, I think this is a moment where people are eager and they're willing to lend a helping hand. So we want to make sure that in this new normal, volunteerism is open to everyone, which speaks to another trend that we're seeing. There's an increased mandate for nonprofits to have their board leadership teams reflect more of the clients and community that they serve. And this provides a really great opportunity to engage newcomers, racialized individuals, and people that are facing multiple barriers to help them demonstrate their skills in these leadership roles. And leaders of volunteers, I believe, can play a huge role here to ensure that this is an open and fair recruitment process, because boards typically recruit their own,
Right.
and that has to stop.
Yeah.
And so going forward,
Yeah.
I think, the leaders of volunteers can really play a role there. And,
Excellent.
I at Volunteer NBC, we aspire to fuel purposeful connections between people to respond to the most pressing social issues in our community. And this is where I think volunteers can really, really come to the table. But we need senior leadership at nonprofits to buy into this, to see the value of volunteers and to see what they can bring to the table.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Carine. Heather, do you want to jump in on this idea of change and then maybe walk us through how this change has impacted this really important role of volunteer manager, who, many organizations maybe do or don't have, and anyway, but that responsibility still exists. Anyway, jump in here on this idea of change and relationship building.
For sure, thank you. And with things that Kim and Carine have said, I think we've all recognized that volunteers have stepped forward. People have wanted to get involved. There was a huge surge, and as we've seen that rise in grassroots groups and neighbors checking on neighbors, that real support. And I think that a challenge that's come out of this has been, the lack of continuity with organizations keeping their volunteer departments and their staffing. There's probably folks on this call who had colleagues that you worked alongside who have either been redeployed, or are no longer with you. I mean, I just a quick personal story. I mean, that was part of my reality. I was working for a large national organization in March of 2020, and by May of 2020, I had completed a volunteer engagement call. We were preparing some leadership roles. That was at 10 o'clock in the morning, and by noon, I had been laid off and put on queues and been told that in all reality, just given the fact that there was all this uncertainty around availability of funding and the opportunities to do fundraising events, and just that was part of our nature of what we were doing, I suddenly found myself unemployed. And after 20 plus years in the business, that was, wow. But there was one in two of us that was our reality. And if you're in the healthcare or hospital sector, there's a really good reality that a number of people that may have worked in your foundation or may have been involved, in your volunteer programs in your departments, who may find themselves being permanently redeployed. And, so there's a huge loss in the dedicated personnel to be able to build those relationships. That's the key of what we do. Kim alluded to this at the beginning. Databases and technology assist us in what we do, but it is that ability to build those relationships, to have that conversation, to engage with someone who calls and says, I'd like to get involved, but I'm unsure, where my skills would be best fit. It's sitting down with staff who are like, we've been asked to do more with less. Less funding is coming in, and how can we engage volunteers? It's that conversation around maybe that reluctant staff member who's like, I don't know that I actually want to volunteer in my program, where we can help them understand the value that it's not a competition, that it's an opportunity to engage the community, to build that goodwill, to provide those services and make those connections, which as this pandemic continues and hopefully as we move to the other side of it, we're going to be able to take that with us. But I know personally, I have a concern, in what that's going to look like without having dedicated volunteer professionals, in our organizations. Here at Volunteer Halton, we've got some organizations who were fortunate enough to retain volunteer staff, others for whom it's now what I call you're doing something and volunteer engagement. And it always seems to be that way. You're the program and volunteer engagement. Volunteer engagement doesn't often come out to be first. So we know if you're doing this off the side of your desk,
right.
If it is a portion of your job, it's not 100%. And so that's going to have an impact as volunteers get re-engaged, as we build up our capacity to actually welcome volunteers back. So, the loss of expertise is going to have a profound ripple effect on our sector's ability to recover. Because there are hundreds and thousands of lost volunteer connections that have taken years and leadership to develop. Just some, at the peak of the pandemic, about 24% of nonprofits in Ontario laid off staff, with 23% of those ones laying off 10 or more people. And I don't have a firm number on this, but I would guess that a number of those organizations, and that if you laid off 10 or more people, they were members of your volunteer team that probably were redeployed or found themselves, without work. And the layoffs in the nonprofit sector were actually have been twice as severe as they were when what we experienced in the 2008 and 2009 global recession. So we look at that as being terrible. And it was, but what's happening now? So, that loss of connection with the volunteer professional is resulting in a loss of the volunteer engagement. And as that phone rings, and if there isn't anyone to pick it up, we're going to have that's going to be something we're going to need to work towards. And I know the folks that are on this call those are questions you're thinking about of how are we going to re-engage the individuals who were with us and either haven't been able to meet some of the essential service needs that we've had, have brought up their concerns around how they're going to, roles that have changed, and how are we going to re-engage that group of individuals, but how are we also going to bring in those who are like, I'd like to get involved.
Right.
And it's that expertise around the table, that sharing, to be able to build those relationships, that it's going to be required to help build back better, for this sector.
You've opened my eyes to this idea of we've lost real corporate memory here, right? Which is a really interesting thing. So Jane, I'm wondering, with that context and building on all the good things we've heard so far, and we're starting to get into solutions maybe a little bit, but what else can we be doing as a sector to be rebuilding those relationships and rebuilding, quite frankly, this asset, now that I think about it, right? Like, what a huge asset that we've lost. So Jane, what are your thoughts as we kind of build back better?
Okay, and I'm going to say build forward. It's my mantra. We don't build backwards, we build forwards. And so I am really, really advocating for that kind of thinking. We knew, as Carine mentioned, we had the evidence that volunteering in traditional informal settings, I'm going to add that piece, was declining prior to the pandemic. However, research done by Volunteer Canada, Ipsos Reid, Stats Canada also looked at, for the first time, the actual numbers related to informal volunteering. And it's really interesting coming out of the pandemic. And when we're talking about how do we build forward, that has a significant role to play, and how we interact and partner with that informal volunteering can be really an advantage. So when we talk about, and I'm going to, again, sort of say, I don't agree that we've lost the asset of volunteerism. I'm going to say that it's changed. It's changed dramatically. There is, as Kim said, there's a lot of interest, a lot of desire to give back. And it's how we facilitate that as nonprofit and charitable organizations that's going to help drive community needs and meeting community needs in a forward motion. So I think that the whole concept of informal volunteering, equity in volunteering is going to be massive. And I know this sounds like jumping on the bandwagon and following a trend, but a recent paper or some recent research that came out of the International Association of Volunteer Effort, the International Forum for Volunteering in Development, and the United Nations State of the World's Volunteerism Report, which Dr. Alice Chadwick Ali, sorry, I'm from the University of Bath, I'm trying to get all this in really quickly, has written sort of a discussion paper on, because those 3 pieces of research are really long. So I've looked at all of them, and hundreds of pages, but really awesome stuff. Really focuses on how increasing inequities, climate change, the social and economic impact of COVID have impacted volunteerism. And it really talks about the fact that we need to invest in volunteerism as nations and demonstrate the value, because what inclusion can do, I mean, Carine, you talked about the impact it can have on the newcomer, the marginalized populations, but by including those marginalized populations in our volunteer work, we gain a breadth of understanding. We can build our programs to truly respond and work with those marginalized communities in resolving issues. And what this paper was really clear about is that what volunteers bring is not a cheap human resource. It is experience, knowledge, innovation, lived and living experience that they can help come up with solutions for the very issues that we are trying to solve. And so I think that's important. Going to what Heather talked about, the challenge with an emergency is, by its very nature, it's short-sighted, right? You have to focus on the now, because you're responding to something that we weren't anticipating. As much as we had the plans in place, 15, 20 years ago, they hadn't been addressed. So we had to rewrite them because everything had changed. And so it's really now about taking that and pushing aside that short-sightedness and looking to the future and figuring out how we can sort of move forward.
Brilliant.
The last piece that I really wanted to talk about is the technology. And one of the pieces that came out of this report is the fact that technology has become integrated into volunteer engagement, and it is not a separate and distinct piece. So we don't have just volunteer roles that are virtual roles. and volunteer roles that are in person, but we have to start thinking about how we integrate those two things into an overall volunteer response. So those are the kinds of pieces that will help drive us forward as and we build out of this pandemic.
Right. I
I
love,
think I'll leave it at that because I know we're really tight for time and I know that everybody else should be involved in this discussion, but I could talk about this stuff for hours on
well,
end.
it's
I find it really exciting and fascinating.
brilliant. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Jane. Thank you all four of you for your getting us going there. And I love this build forward. I'm going to steal that. So consider it picked up there, Jane. Thank you. Let's jump in and we got it. Yeah, look at this. We got 15 minutes left. Maybe in the chat, I see a couple comments in the chat. Maybe in the chat, I'm wondering if we should take our last time together to think about can we be offering some practical hands-on advice for the leaders on the call around how we build forward with our new volunteer programs? And I open this up to everyone. If you've got some suggestions, throw it in the chat, but let's go around our circle again with some fast and furious and really maybe some specific suggestions that you've got from your vantage point on how organizations can be reigniting their volunteer base. So any practical suggestions, Kim? Again, fast and furious responses.
I am
here.
fast and furious.
You are. You are.
I really am.
There it is, official. It's official, ladies and gentlemen.
It's
right
there. And
right
this
there.
is recorded to let you know, but Fast and Furious, I'm going to say it's screening volunteers in and not out. It's looking at your practices. What are the hoops that people need to jump through to get involved with your organization? And how can you mitigate risk? We do need to recognize that, right? Risk for your clients, for volunteers themselves. But how do we make this that it's something that all people can engage with your organization in some shape or form?
I love that. Screen in, not out. That's powerful. That's a great takeaway for everyone here, Kim. Thank you. Carine, what are any practical thoughts and tips you've got for people?
It's going to be so important to really make sure that we elevate the role of the leader of a volunteer, because if they don't get to those decision-making tables, we're going to continue with this disconnect, and that can't happen anymore.
Sorry, Carine, you faded out there. We need to connect with who? Sorry.
We need to connect with the top leadership, and unless that happens, there's always going to be that disconnect, and the volunteers will be there, but these leaders of volunteers won't have the power or the impact that they could have by engaging those volunteers. So for me, it really, when I say from the top, it has to come from the board. They have to understand, and they of all people should understand because they're volunteers themselves. But that's the last thing they ever consider. For me, a leader or volunteer should be at every leadership meeting. They should always be there at the same level as somebody that's in an HR role.
Brilliant. Oh, that's a powerful statement. There's something to go challenge our boards with, eh? Love it. Heather, jump in. What are some practical advice?
I would build on that and also say, connect with each other and let's stop thinking of volunteers as ours, and let's share them so that I have opportunity. Oftentimes you might be the only person. If somebody says, can I talk to somebody in the volunteer department? You're like, yep, here we are. So, make sure that you build time into your calendar as best you can to get involved with networking and sharing and knowing sort of what the nonprofit down the street from you is offering, because someone might call you and you don't have a role for the skills they're looking for or whatever it is, but you can say, hey, so-and-so down the street, Carine, Jane, Kim down the street, has an opportunity available. So let's be enablers of each other's opportunities as well, so that, we build, as we build building that forward, we all build forward together, and build our own connections as engagement leaders, but also build forward our community to serve.
Awesome. I encourage you, if you have got questions for a group, to drop them in the chat. I see one or two here, which we'll circle back to. Jane, some practical advice for anyone who's listening today.
Yeah, so I like a lot of the things that were said by my peers here, and I really strongly advocate for shared volunteering and for risk assessment within our organizations and how we plan. So I think that we have become an incredibly risk averse society in the Northern Hemisphere. And it was interesting, some reads about how we could learn from some of our Southern developing nations who are really looking at how to engage the grassroots in the work that we do. Because, and you know, when we put rules in place, and so if there's anyone on boards here, when we put policies in place that say, if there is anything on a police records check, we will not accept. It is the worst, most damaging thing that we can do, because we are screening out people who could really impact the work and inform the work that we do. And so I think that is hugely important, and that we need to think about our risk tolerance and be much more open to broader access for volunteers. And I'm not saying that we don't do proper intake anymore, but I am saying that we have become overly risk averse. And I think that engaging diverse communities in our program design through volunteerism can only benefit us all as we move forward.
Love it. The great Anne-Marie Simpson's got great language in here, Anne-Marie. Well done. Risk intelligence as opposed to risk mitigation. I love that. Really super smart.
Yes.
So to build on that last point there, Jane, there's a question here around in our chat. He says, scrolling up from Nicola. Is there any practical advice for engaging diverse communities to volunteer? So let's get in the weeds a bit on this one. And we've got about 10 minutes left. I do apologize for that. But for panelists, let me just open up practical advice for engaging diverse communities.
So
I think, oh, go ahead.
Carine, you go first.
I did put something in the chat to respond. Great question, but I think relying on your volunteer center to do that work on your behalf makes a lot of sense. We know how to reach out to these diverse communities. We know how to work with settlement organizations. We know how to get you know, those people that are interested in leadership positions that come from a racialized background. And so for me, it would definitely be to really rely on your volunteer center and work together to make that happen. But you also, you know, have to make sure that you're open to accept your organization, because Nicola, you may be, but what about your senior leadership team? If a volunteer as a newcomer comes in and they don't see themselves reflected, you know, either amongst the staff or amongst the board, then they're quickly going to realize, you know, this is not the place for me. And, you know, we as volunteer centers, we really strive to make those meaningful connections. And if that is not reciprocated at the other end, then, you know, it's going to be a bad experience and they'll never volunteer again.
Great insights. Anyone else want to jump into that? Jane, go ahead.
Yeah, I think coming out of the pandemic, we've seen how grassroots organizations have stepped up to help many of us in the response work that we've been doing. And so you have those connections. So as much as you may not have them top of mind, there are many grassroots organizations that have been doing things to help deliver services in the area that you do work. And so tapping into those groups, seeing how you can partner, having conversations with them will help you diversify in your own formal volunteering roles as well.
And Kurt, if I can just jump in as well, I'd just like to say, I think this is a really great opportunity to hold a mirror up to yourself as a leader of volunteers or a leader of organizations, and hold a mirror up to the processes and the hoops that we have designed. There is, I love how Anne-Marie, and a big shout out to Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie was the chair of our board for a number of years and very involved, and still involved as a volunteer in supporting some work that we do around board governance. But risk intelligence versus, being so risk averse, I think is really important. But holding a mirror up to ourselves, what are the paradigms that we have that maybe we don't even realize? What are the processes that we've instituted and in those institutions, if you will, that create such barriers for people? Even if you think your messaging is welcoming and diverse, have we asked anyone? What is the feedback of that? If I'm an individual who identifies as in the LGBTQ plus community, but on your application, you have two choices, whether I check a box, whether it is male or female. How are we providing welcoming communities? So really, I think for me, holding that mirror up and understanding what is our unconscious bias and doing some deep learning for ourselves as well will help.
Excellent. Heather, do you want to jump in?
I agree with everything that has been said so far. I also think, it's inviting the communities that you want to engage for their feedback, asking them, why is it perhaps they're not getting involved, and being open to the responses, and being able to take that forward. And to Carine's point, ensuring that our senior leadership hears that as well, that, that they're involved in those conversations, that they have input into them, and that they also, make this a priority around the table. If they're going to be serious about it, that it has to come from the top down, but we can help facilitate. Again, we're the relationship builders. So let's engage that community to find out what it is that they believe we do, and how would they want to get involved.
Lots of great chats and feedback here in the chat. I encourage you to have a look there. Sarah's reminding us that the demographics of our communities are changing, and so that means that this volunteer process needs to change as well. And Deb has got lots of great comments in there around, and Deb, I really appreciate it. As a communicator, I really appreciate this, the link between good volunteer management and good communications, right? And how we're engaging and connecting with people. So I appreciate that. 4 minutes left. So from each of you, so like 30 seconds each. And I know this is going to be hard. What is the one thing you want us to take away as we think about the power of volunteerism, how our systems are changing? What is the one thing that we should be taking back? Let's do this. What's the one message we should be taking back to our boards about volunteer management going into as we build forward? What's the one message we should be taking to our boards as we think about building forward? Go. Jane, we'll start with you.
Okay. Volunteers are not a free resource. They deserve investment from our organizations, and our organizations will benefit dramatically from investing in our volunteers.
Love it. Carine.
I'm going to build on that.
Yeah.
That organizations need to also invest in the volunteer engagement professionals to equally, because we will also benefit from that.
For me, it's you can't build forward unless you engage volunteers equitably.
And I'll just wrap it up by saying it's about a value proposition. You have the data, you have the head and the heart that you can come together to create some good storytelling. You talk about Kurt Hammond, master of communications, through his work in a lot of ways. It's really important to be able to tell that story.
Excellent. Wow. Seriously, where did that hour go, right? We could spend the next 3 days chatting about volunteerism. How about a round of applause for all our speakers and their insights? Excellent. I want to thank Carine, Jane, Heather, and Kim for their knowledge, their insights, and those last takeaways. Boy, I hope we were taking some notes there, because that's a great way to start our next board meeting, isn't it? Here's, as we think about building forward, here's how we need to be investing in this. With that, a quick reminder that we have heard that volunteerism is incredibly powerful to our sector, that it is changing. I think the challenge back to us is we need to change with it. We need to be making sure that we're building this idea of equity into every opportunity we have to screen in, not screen out. And it's up to us as leaders in our organizations to be taking the message, and Jane articulated this well, they're not just cheap assets or resources here. These are tools in the healthiest sense of the word there to help us grow our organization and do more work with. So with that, that is our time, everyone. Thank you so much for being involved. Make sure you grab some of the conversations from the chat there. Tomorrow, we're chatting about this idea of equity and how do we lean into this important, sometimes challenging conversation, with a level of authenticity, right? So hope you can join us tomorrow for a chat about how we can be thinking about equity, can be driving both our operational and our strategic initiatives for the next while. With that, on behalf of Kim, thank you all so much for your time. Great session as always. Thanks to our speakers. Have a great afternoon, everyone. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow at noon. Many thanks.
Same time, same place.
Oh, and final shout out for Riverfest. Get your Riverfest tickets.
Oh, Guelph.
Yeah.
I love you, Guelph.
Brilliant.
Deb, I'm so glad that you're here.
Yep.